I'd like to thank Greg McClay and the Randall Library for hosting me today. And now, Tales from a Reluctant World Traveler. Cholera, plague, Japanese encephalitis, typhoid, typhus, trench fever, yellow fever, dengue fever, diphtheria, dysentery. That's just a sampling of what I could face on an upcoming 4-month solo trip around the world. According to the experts, I wasn't supposed to drink the water, eat the food, or kiss the women. Swimming in fresh water and walking around barefoot, definitely out. But there was one thing I feared more than any ghastly third world disease. I'll get to that later. So actually, this trip took place in 2007. I'd been working as an editor at PC World magazine. I was there for 15 years. One day, laid off. 3 months later, my girlfriend gave me the old heave-ho. So I moped around my apartment for a couple of days. I moped around the coffee shop. I moped around the gym. And finally, I moped around the local bookstore. And I found myself in the travel section. And I started thumbing through the Lonely Planets, Rough Guides, you know those beautiful travel books. They've got the lovely photos and the great text describing all these great places you'll go and the things you'll do. And pretty soon I could almost smell the coconut suntan lotion. I could hear the bellowing of macaws and the screeching of howler monkeys. But there was one thing that concerned me. Every one of these guidebooks had a graphic, detailed passage on sexually transmitted diseases. My first reaction was, ugh. Then I thought, you know, maybe these world travelers are a friendly bunch. So I went ahead, using the books, and booked a 4-month solo trip around the world. I started in Boston, went to Venezuela, Greece, South Africa, Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, Australia, New Zealand, and then back to Boston. 4 months, solo travel. Now, most people, when they go on an exotic trip, when they get back, they just rave about the food and the sights and the friendly local people. I'm not going to say they're lying. I'm just going to say my experience was a little different. You could say there was some teachable moments. There were some learning experiences. Actually, I'm not going to lie. I had a rotten, miserable time for large portions of the trip. And I take some responsibility for that. Before going on this trip, I was not an experienced traveler. I'd gone on 2-week vacations in Canada, I'd been 2 weeks in Mexico, I'd been to Europe. But a 4-month solo trip around the world is a different animal. And you don't really know if you're configured to do it until you do it. Actually, on the trip, after 2 weeks, I was in Venezuela. I was ready to come home, but I'd already bragged to all my friends that, you know, I'm not worried about being laid off and being dumped by my girlfriend. I'm taking a trip around the world. Another issue was I'm not the hardiest person in the world. Public toilets, you know, some people put down 1 layer of toilet paper. I put down 3. I'm also not fond of loud noises, weird smells, or being crammed together with people who sweat. Another issue is I'm a little concerned about disease. So one thing I did on the trip, so I bought all the tickets, and then for some reason, that's when I started doing a lot of the research. Don't ask me why, it's just how it happened. So I came across this slide on the Center for Disease Control website. So this is a map of the diarrhea hotspots around the world. Now, if you look at where I was going and the diarrhea hotspots, you'll notice that there's quite a bit of overlap, and I've highlighted them with these black arrows. So basically, I was going to be hitting all the diarrhea hotspots around the world. But there was one thing that concerned me even more. It was something called guinea worm disease. Any of you guys know? Okay, never heard of it? Yeah, so guinea worm disease it's a parasite. I mentioned earlier that the experts recommend against, in certain countries, drinking the water, swimming in fresh water, and what they're concerned about are parasites. So with guinea worm disease, you ingest some infected water, the parasite gets into your body, and over time, it grows into a 3-foot worm. And apparently you can feel this thing crawling around under your skin. And then when it's time to reproduce, it pops its head out of a blister in your foot. Geez, what's... Ah! So that was guinea worm disease. At this point, I figured it was time to consult an expert. Six weeks before my departure, I found myself in the waiting room of a Boston clinic. A nurse wearing a black hoodie under a lab coat hustles me into her office. Her computer has a bumper sticker. I stop for entrails. So, she asks, where are we heading? Let's see, I'm going to Greece, South Africa, Venezuela, Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia. Wow, wish I got that much vacation. Actually, I just lost my job. Aw, bummer. She taps her keyboard and then looks directly at me. You're gonna need 7 shots, 3 more visits, and we'll need some blood. A newbie, you'll be fine. Then she hands me pamphlets on malaria and something called chikungunya fever. Then she starts doling out the prescriptions. If you get the runs, in Vietnam, take ciprofloxacin. In Thailand, take azithromycin. In Cambodia, I want you to take Pepto-Bismol daily. It can turn your tongue black, but some women might like that look. By the time she finishes with me, I'm afraid to leave my apartment, never mind the country. But there's no turning back. I've already spent $6,000 on plane tickets. I better come back with something that doesn't require antibiotics. A job, a woman, or at least some material for my Match.com profile. Actually, the best thing about my visit to the nurse, she said the countries I'm going to, no guinea worms. So, off I went. On August 28th, 2007, I depart for Venezuela with one piece of luggage, my new $200 backpack crammed with overpriced travel clothes, medications, water purifying tablets, earplugs, nose plugs, dust masks, safety pins, bobby pins, duct tape, scotch tape, surgical tape, Allen wrenches, and other gear recommended by the guidebooks. As the flight attendant discusses water landings, sweat collects beneath the money belt strapped under my pants. You can see the money belt there. I glance at my seatmates, 2 elderly women sucking on hard candies. They don't seem worried. Last year, I went to France and came back in one piece. But Venezuela is a little more dangerous than France. Okay, it's a lot more dangerous than France. Okay, it has one of the highest murder rates in the world. And at the Caracas airport, a driver is picking me up at the international terminal just to take me 100 yards to the domestic terminal because it's not safe to walk around outside. But if some hoodlum draws a weapon, I'll just fork over the decoy travel wallet around my neck, containing $20 and an expired Macy's charge card. These guidebooks know all the tricks. As I'm adjusting the decoy wallet, I hear a loud crack and clutch my seat cushion, which I've heard can double as a flotation device. A cloud of cinnamon stings inside my nostrils. The woman next to me is chomping on a fireball. I sneeze into the sleeve of my moisture-wicking Oxford and resume my personal inventory. A hidden security pocket in the shirt contains photocopies of my passport and credit cards, plus U.S. consulate phone numbers for the 7 countries I'm visiting. My money belt holds my wad of plane tickets, $500 in cash, and a list of Western-trained doctors on each continent. I've emailed myself scanned images of my tickets, passport, and immunization card. I've taken every precaution recommended by the guidebooks and the State Department. The rest is up to fate. There's a tap on my arm. I instinctively cover my money belt with my hand. The woman next to me smiles and hands me a jawbreaker. Her elbow brushes mine. I relinquish the armrest and stare at the ceiling. The seatbelt sign goes off. The drink cart is free to move about the cabin. So my first stop was Venezuela. You can see it's right here. It's the southern end of the Caribbean. And as I mentioned before, I was flying into the international terminal and then taking a connection, a domestic flight. I was going to a place called Margarita Island. Now, Margarita Island was the Venezuela equivalent of Martha's Vineyard. And I was there to go windsurfing. So I signed up with this trip with a windsurfing outfit on Margarita Island, and they're the ones that gave me all the instructions on how to deal with getting in and out of the airport. So basically they said to me, when you get to the airport, there's going to be a guy with a sign with your name on it. You follow him. So I get to the airport, I find the guy, we go outside, we get into this huge black SUV. We drive 100 yards from the international terminal to the domestic terminal. He grabs me by the hand, takes me inside, buys me my ticket to go from Caracas to Margarita Island. He says, here's your ticket. You sit in that chair and you stay there until they call your flight. So I did what he told me. And you know what? I got it. Caracas is a little dangerous. So I mentioned there were some issues with the trip itself, and I take some responsibility. So this whole notion of budget travel, so all these guidebooks, Lonely Planet and Rough Guide, they're talking about budget travel. You're not taking some prepackaged, pre-planned trip. You're going to do it on your own. And when they talk about budget travel, what they're talking about is something called backpacking. And generally, most people go backpacking when they're in their 20s. When I did this trip, I was 48 years old. So this whole notion of backpacking, which means living out of a backpack. So here's, actually, you're living out of 2 backpacks. So my backpack is right over there. That's one I took on the trip. So basically, you're traveling for 4 months and you're wearing the same clothes. So if it didn't fit in the backpack, it didn't go on the trip. So I was wearing the same clothes for 4 months. I did wash them, but some of them, when I got home, some of these clothes I had to just burn. Some of them I was able to keep. Washed them several times and they were fine. These pants I wore on the trip, so this is back in 2007, and this shirt. Now the backpack, let me just show you demonstrate how this works. So you have 2 backpacks. You have a small backpack, which goes on the front. And in this backpack, you put your tickets, your water, anything else that you might need right away. And then on your back goes the big backpack. So if any of you are hikers, you'll know that these big, serious backpacks have these hip straps. If you're traveling like I was traveling, backpacking, you hook the straps behind you. You basically don't use them because you need to be able to send this backpack through security detectors, x-ray machines, and you also need to be able to get it up above into the carry-on area of the plane. Now, another issue with budget travel is, so I was traveling for 4 months. That's almost 120 nights. I couldn't afford to stay at Hyatt Regencies every night. So if you're traveling, backpacking, these guidebooks suggest you stay at a youth hostel. And who stays at youth hostels? Youths. So I was 48 years old. Most of these people were in their 20s. And actually, here's a photo of us in New Zealand. And you can see, if you look around the table, there's all my backpacker friends, and they're all waving their hands. Yeah, this is great. And if you look in the corner over there where the red arrow is, you can see me, and I'm basically, just get me out of here. So the issues were living out of a backpack, staying in youth hostels with people less than half my age. Another issue was the flights. So again, I couldn't afford to go first class. I couldn't afford to go business class. I was barely flying coach. So what that meant is I was taking a lot of red-eye flights. And these flights also had multiple stops. And the way I set it up was whenever I had a flight with multiple stops, each stopover I made sure it was 4 or 5 hours. So that way if my flight came in late, I wouldn't miss the next flight, because if you miss the next flight, it's kind of a cascading domino effect and you could be stuck someplace. So here's a map. I had, during a 1 month period, I had 3 red-eye flights. So here's a sample. I went from Venezuela to Greece, it's standard US to, Eastern Hemisphere to going to Europe. Then I went from Greece to South Africa. That was a 10-hour flight. But the worst flight of all was going from South Africa to Bangkok. So this was basically between the stops and the flying, it was 28 hours plus a 5-hour time change. And here's so that's actually a photo of me when I got off the plane. So the way it worked in Bangkok, I flew for this flight. I left Cape Town at 7 a.m. I flew to Johannesburg. I had a 4 or 5 hour stopover. I flew from Johannesburg to Hong Kong, 5-hour stopover, and then from Hong Kong to Bangkok. So I left at 7 a.m. and I arrived at 4 p.m. the following day. And this was a little rough. And did I mention that I was staying in youth hostels filled with youths? Still, there was one thing I feared more than a youth hostel filled with youths, and I'm going to get to that a little later. Another issue was there was kind of a disconnect between my expectations and the realities of some of the places I was visiting. So one thing, I was, on this trip, I was going windsurfing. A lot of these places I was windsurfing. Venezuela, Martha's Vineyard, Margarita Island. It's their Martha's Vineyard, world famous windsurfing area. It was fabulous, and this is actually a photo of the beach in Margarita Island. So as a windsurfer, I was like a beginner, intermediate windsurfer, so I could handle 15 miles an hour, 20 miles an hour. Venezuela, great. I didn't get murdered even once, and the windsurfing was fabulous. But my next stop was a Greek island called Carpathos, another world famous windsurfing area. So again, I'm hoping for 15, 20 mile an hour winds. I get to Carpathos, and it's more like this, which is 40, 50 mile an hour winds. I mean, small craft warnings. This was more than I could deal with. I started off at the adult beach, and I couldn't stay on my board, so they basically grabbed me by the ear, moved me down to the kids' beach. I still couldn't stay on the windsurfer because it was just too rough and the wind was too strong, so I spent most of the trip either in the water or in my bed with a cold. Little mismatch with expectations. So after Carpathos, Greece, I was going to go windsurfing in South Africa. So again, I was expecting something peaceful like this. But when I was in Cape Town, and I'm thumbing through the travel literature, and I'm trying to pick a nice place to windsurf, I noticed that they had another activity in the same waters where they had the windsurfing. And that activity is shark cage diving. So the way the shark cage diving works is you go out on a boat. Well, first you pay them a lot of money. Then they take you out on a boat, and they put you into this metal cage. Then they drop you over the side, and you get to pet the great white sharks. So I thought to myself, okay, windsurfing, great white sharks, windsurfing, great white sharks, windsurfing, great white sharks, windsurfing, great white sharks. No, thank you. Still, there was one thing I feared more than being eaten alive by a great white shark, and I'll get to that a little later. Another issue was, all these guidebooks and the travel literature, they always have, things to do and see. So some of the recommendations were a little off. So I was in Cambodia, and any of you heard of Angkor Wat? So this is the largest religious structure in the world. It's in Cambodia, and if you want to go to Angkor Wat, you're going to stay in a little town called Siem Reap. So I went to Angkor Wat. It was fine, but one day of looking at temples was enough for me. So I was looking around for other activities, and one of the other recommended activities was a visit to the crocodile farm in town. So if you look at the crocodile, they're 16, 18-foot reptiles. And here's an aerial view, and you can see the reptiles, they're out there, the crocodiles are out there sunning. And this red arrow, there's a wall there, and on the other side of the wall, I noticed that there was a swimming hole filled with children. No, thank you. Another activity, this was also in Cambodia. Are any of you familiar with the history of Cambodia? Yeah, it's pretty harsh. So basically, the 70s, 80s, and 90s, it was pretty much non-stop war. So there was civil war, genocide, you've heard of Pol Pot, invasion from the Vietnamese, more civil war. This went on for almost 30 years. The country wasn't stable didn't have a stable government until 1998, 1999. I was there in 2007. So yeah, they had a stable government from what I could tell. But one of the issues was all these years of war, large portions of the population were running around with military-grade weapons. So they decided, some of the entrepreneurial types decided to start a shooting range for tourists, and it was called Thunder Ranch. And my understanding of how this worked is you go to Thunder Ranch and they give you a menu. Column 1 are drinks. Column 2, military-grade weapons, and column 3 were livestock. So you could go and maybe get a martini, a rocket launcher, and then blow up a cow. Or if maybe you're more a beer and wine person, you get maybe a white nice sauterne, a machine gun, and then you could just shoot up a bunch of chickens. No, thank you. And then another issue was omissions and flagrant inaccuracies in the guidebooks and the travel literature. So one of the first ones, let me just read this to you. This takes place in Australia, in Melbourne. After dumping my bags at Melbourne's Woolloomooloo Inn, a Best Western knockoff near the center of town, I ambled down Swanston Street to the waterfront, the Yarrow River, taking in the Aussie scene. A fly lands on my lip. I swat it away. Crossing Bourke Street, I spot the stone facade and copper dome of Melbourne's historic Flinders Street train station. Skyscrapers hover in the distance. So here we have the Flinders Street train station. We've got stone facade, copper dome, and we've got some skyscrapers hovering in the distance. Another fly, another swat. A woman in a suit exits the train station and waves. Do I know her? A tattooed girl on a cell phone waves too. Then a guy with a skateboard. Something tunnels in my nose. Something skitters in my underwear. Flies are collecting on me as if I were a rotting carcass. I join everyone around me, cursing, waving, and swatting. I flee down Flinders Street and duck into the Melbourne Aquarium. Animal feeding time begins in 5 minutes. Then I notice the admission price, $25. Outside, the flies are feeding. I've just traveled through Southeast Asia, a land of deadly mosquitoes and terrifying diseases. A few Western bugs shouldn't faze me, but my t-shirt is now a vibrating vest of flies. I run bobbing and weaving by a movie theater. $12 for a Mel Gibson flick. I'm Jewish. We don't pay retail for Mel Gibson movies. Back at the Woolloomooloo Inn, I confront the hotel desk clerk as if she were somehow to blame. What's with the flies? I thought Australia was a civilized first world country. She says nothing and hands me a tourist info card entitled The Australian Bushfly. Highlights. From October through January, bushflies are common in Melbourne. The insects feed on bodily fluids, tears, sweat, saliva, and mucus. Bush flies do not bite or sting. They lay their eggs in animal dung, not on humans. What a relief. The Aussie salute, a waving motion used by locals to repel the flies. Suggestion, wear a hat with a mesh net that covers the face. A sign behind the desk clerk advertises mesh net hats with the Woolaroo logo for $30. I don't pay retail for hats with logos. So the whole issue with the bush flies was there was no mention in any of the guidebooks or any of the travel literature about Australian bush flies. Still, there was one thing I feared more than being buried alive by Australian bush flies, and I'll get to that a little later. Here's a slide of some Australian bush flies. Here's another slide of Australian bush flies. Actually, this is more than an inaccuracy. It's not quite a lie, but it's a flagrant mistake. This was in Lonely Planet. So the guidebooks, they all recommend in Southeast Asia you can stay at a hostel, or you could stay at something called a guest house. Now, when I think of when I hear the word guest house, I was thinking, maybe like a Vermont bed and breakfast. Something with exposed beams and a pillow-top mattress. And maybe, for breakfast, they serve you blueberry pancakes with authentic maple syrup. So my first guest house in Phnom Penh, I check in and, okay, this is called the King Guest House, and it doesn't really look like what I was expecting. It's called the King Guest House, and it was in Phnom Penh, and this was a Lonely Planet recommendation. Let me read you the review of the King Guest House. Elvis lives on in Phnom Penh, in name at least. The range of rooms is as wide as the king's girth in the later years of his life. And there is a huge restaurant and travel center downstairs. Lonely Planet. Let me read you my experience at the King Guest House. It's after midnight, and the King lobby is secured by a locked metal gate. I can just see a night watchman snoozing in a hammock draped with a ripped mosquito net. I tap on the gate. The man jumps up to let me in. I tip him $1. He gives me a little bow and climbs back into the hammock. As I start towards the darkened stairs, something lumbers around a couch, bolts past the hammock, and settles under a melamine end table. The creature is too large to be a squirrel and too small to be a Rottweiler. I crouch for a better look. It's a rat. A half-bald rat. I follow the expert's advice for encounters with Cambodian wildlife and look for threatening gestures. Teeth gnashing, hair bristling, back arching, foot drumming, growling, ear flattening, tail between the legs, backward earth flinging with hind feet. The night watchman snores. The rat remains still, watching me. I check for foaming mouth, cowering pups nearby, teardrop tattoos around the eyes. All clear, but the bald spot bothers me. I tiptoe to the staircase, giving the rat a wide berth. Sit, stay, I whisper. The night man doesn't stir. But you don't have to take my word for it. Anybody heard of this book? This came out soon after I got back. It's called Do Travel Writers Go to Hell? And this book is about a Lonely Planet writer. He goes to Brazil. So apparently the way it works is Lonely Planet gives these writers a budget so they can go visit all these places and recommend places to stay and things to do and places to eat. So this particular writer, he's supposed to cover large portions of Brazil. He gets down to Brazil, and the first week or so, he blows all his money. So he hasn't gone very far, hasn't seen much of Brazil, and hasn't reviewed much. So he's out of money, and he still has all this terrain to cover. So he lies. He just makes everything up. Great book. It's a true story. Lonely Planet was not so happy when the book came out, but that's the way it goes. So about 3/4 of the way through the trip, I'm having a miserable, rotten time. I'm depressed, I'm lonely, I haven't contracted a single sexually transmitted disease. I figure I'm going to die alone, and the sooner, the better. So I start ignoring all the advice from the Center for Disease Control and the guidebooks. The first thing I do, I'm in Bangkok, I start eating off these street carts. So this is kind of a typical street cart. It's a cart. It's on mountain bike tires. They can wheel it around. It has some kind of heating element. And as you can see here, all of the food is just sitting out in the air. But it's 30 baht, which is the currency of Thailand. So 30 baht's about $1. $1 for dinner, worth the risk. So I started eating off the food carts. In Bangkok, I ate off food carts all up and down the coast of Vietnam, in Cambodia. I never got sick. Never met anyone on my trip who got sick from eating at any of the food carts. So I started with food, and if you're going to have food, you might as well sample the local vintages. So this is Vietnamese snake wine, and this is actually a big bottle. It's about this high. So you've heard of the tequila from Mexico that's got the worm in it. Vietnam, they're not screwing around. These bottles have an entire cobra in the bottle. And this particular vintage, you can see the cobra, and in his mouth is a scorpion. So the snake wine is supposed to have all these mystical properties. It's supposed to be great for the male virility. I did sample the wine. It didn't do much for my virility, but I survived. I was fine. Had kind of a rubbery, snaky aftertaste, but I survived. Another thing I started doing was, a lot of these countries, they don't have the same liability laws that we have in the US. So they offer these activities called adventure sports. And yeah, a lot of these things are too dangerous to do in the US, or you sign like pages and pages of liability form. So one of the activities I did in New Zealand has two islands. There's a North Island and a South Island. And the South Island, there's a town called Queenstown, which is known for adventure sports. So one of the activities I tried in Queenstown was something called riverboarding. So you've all heard of whitewater rafting? So riverboarding is basically whitewater rafting without the raft. You're on something called, you can see it in the photo here, it's called a boogie board, which is a giant kickboard. And then, as you can see here, these guys are about to enter the rapids. Here's another photo. So this is just somebody's head. They're in the rapids. They're wearing a helmet. I'm guessing they're filming. I'm assuming they survived. I just barely survived, and I wouldn't recommend doing this to anybody, but I lived through it. And again, I mentioned the liability laws. So these activities, they give you a form to fill out, and it's pretty much one paragraph, and it says, if you get injured or hurt, bummer. And while in New Zealand, there was another activity I tried. This is bungee jumping. And the way it works is they bind your feet up with a cord, and then you walk to the end of the platform, and then you turn around and you ask the guy, are you sure this is safe and a good idea? And he's busy doing something else. So you just jump. And when you jump, you yell, "Mommy." And you bounce up and down for a while. And once you stop bouncing up and down, they reel you up with a big winch back up to the platform. So I did this 3 times. I did it in South Africa. I did it twice in New Zealand. This particular jump is in New Zealand, and that's about 450 feet. The one I did in South Africa was considerably higher. It was about 660 feet. So that's about 2 football fields. Has anyone been to the Prue in Boston? And you know they've got that restaurant on top, the top of the hub. So this is the equivalent of going up to the top of the hub and then jumping out the window. And they measure the height of these things. They measure from the platform all the way down to the ground. And the cord doesn't go all the way down to the ground because that would hurt a lot. So the cord generally goes about 2/3 of the way down. You bounce up and down, and then they reel you back up. So has anybody gone skydiving? Yeah, so I've gone skydiving, and that wasn't so, this is much worse, because when you're skydiving, you're up so high, you look down, the ground's kind of fuzzy and surreal. Bungee jumping, you're not up that high, and you can see every rock and tree and anything you might hit if there was a problem. I didn't have any problems. I didn't see anyone that had any problems, any of the places that I did it. I mean, sometimes you'd have people freak out on the platform, but they would eventually jump. But I didn't realize till I got back that actually I found this on YouTube where some people actually did have some problems.
A 22-year-old Australian, Erin Langworthy's bungee jump over the Zambezi River has a certain style as she sets off. Then disaster as her jumping cord snaps and she plunges into the crocodile-infested waters.
It went black. Straight away I felt like I'd been slapped all over.
She came to in the swirling rapids, but with her feet tied together, still not out of danger.
I actually had to swim down and yank the bungee cord out of what it was caught into.
Erin eventually managed to reach the bank of the river, where rescuers pulled her out battered and bruised, but even then her ordeal wasn't over.
When I was first pulled out of the water, they put me on my back, and so all the water that I inhaled meant that I couldn't breathe, so I made them roll me onto my side, and that's when I started coughing out water and blood.
The safari company that organized the jump calls it 111 meters of pure adrenaline on its website, but another look at Erin's jump shows just how lucky she was.
Yes, I think it's definitely a miracle that I survived.
Nazanin Sadri, Al Jazeera.
And finally, it's time to show you the one thing I feared more than youth hostels filled with youths, great white sharks, bungee jumping. So everyone knows what that is. That's a squat toilet. Anybody use one? Okay, yeah. So it's a different experience. And for those of you who've never used a squat toilet, let me just read you a little bit about it. This was my experience. Inside the little room, I reach for a light switch and can't find one. I reach for the door and can't find one. Against the back wall, there's a hole in the floor surrounded by raised porcelain footrests. Across from it, a saucepan floats in a plastic barrel filled with water. Something with legs and a tail skitters up the wall and onto the ceiling. A faucet protruding from the tiled wall drips into the plastic barrel. A boiling sensation intensifies deep inside me. I drop my pants and hover over the hole. I grab the rim of the barrel with one hand for stability. With the other hand, I point myself back like a little hose. Money starts to slip out of my pockets. As I go to catch the cash, my apparatus springs free and sprays my sandals, feet, and pants. All I can do is let it all go. So I think you get the idea. If you want to know more, you'll have to read my book. So all of this pain, misery, suffering from the trip was actually good preparation for my next odyssey, which was book publishing. Writing a book and trying to get it published. Any writers out there? Yeah, okay, so you have an idea what this is about. So on the trip, I mentioned that I spent a lot of time alone. I'm a writer. I'm alone and depressed. I write. So by the time that I got back from the trip, so I kept the blog on the whole trip, and by the time I got back, I had 150 pages of material. And this was 2008, And around that time, this book had been out. It's a travel memoir called Eat, Pray, Love. And by 2007, she sold 5 million copies. So I figured, I sell 1%, 50,000. I'm not a pig. I'll be happy with that. So I read Eat, Pray, Love a couple times. I also read another book. So this is a travel guide, a travel memoir written by a guy called The Sex Lives of Cannibals. It's funny. This guy goes to out to some remote island in the Pacific, has a rotten, miserable time, and he sold a lot of copies of this. So I figured, I wrote for a computer magazine for 15 years. I should be able to write a travel memoir. So I take writing classes. I join writing groups. I go to overpriced writing conferences. And after a year and a half, I have a travel memoir, and I show it to an agent, and the agent says, you know what, there's really no market for travel memoirs anymore. The thing that's hot right now is memoirs. So I don't know if any of you have read this book. It's called Running with Scissors. It was a memoir. It actually takes place in Western Massachusetts. And around the time we're talking, 2008, the movie had come out, Running with Scissors. The movie did very well. Also around this time, there was another memoir called A Million Little Pieces. Anybody, so some of you are familiar with this? So what happened with this book is the guy wrote a novel, A Million Little Pieces. He couldn't sell it, so then he said, oh, bummer, I forgot. It's not a novel, it's all true, it's a memoir. So he gets a big book deal. Oprah recommends it on her book list. He's selling a lot of copies. And one day he's on her show. So there he is, James Frey, sitting with Oprah. And they're talking, and it comes out that actually he lied. It wasn't really true. He made up a lot of it. But he still sold millions of copies. So I was like, fine, James Frey can do it. I can do it. So I take writing classes. I join writing groups. I go to more overpriced writing conferences. And after another year and a half, I have a memoir. So I show it to an agent, and she says, you know what? Actually, there's no market for memoirs anymore unless you're a Kennedy. And I'm like, oh, wait a minute. Actually, I am a Kennedy. You can see my photo there. I actually didn't fool anybody. And her recommendation was for me to, as a first-time author, my best option for getting a book published was write a novel. So I signed up for more writing classes, joined more writing groups, and went to more overpriced writing conferences. And after another year and a half, I had a novel. And I showed it to an agent, and the agent said, you know what? Have you ever thought about making this into a travel memoir? And I was like, ugh. And I was, ugh. And I was, ugh. But then I thought to myself, wait a minute. I thought back to my trip, and I was like, wait a minute. I just survived this, and I survived that, and I survived this. So I doubled down. I rewrote the novel, and also around this time I had started performing bits and pieces out of the novel at local open mics in Boston. And one day I was at a party, and I was talking to a guy who was a theater director. And he said, you know what? You've got enough material. I can help you turn that into a 1-hour, one-man show. So with his help, I created a one-man show called The Chronic Singles Handbook. And what I did is there's a circuit of amateur theater festivals around the US, Canada, actually it goes around the world, and they're called Fringe theater festivals. So I performed this show at more than 25 different Fringe festivals in the US, Canada, and I did one in Edinburgh, Scotland. And actually, let me tell you about it. The Chronic Singles Handbook is about a chronically single guy who takes a trip around the world hoping to change his luck with love. Sounds kind of wholesome and sweet. You've heard of Eat, Pray, Love? We mentioned it here. But actually, this really isn't Eat, Pray, Love. There's adult situations, there's adult language, and there's more adult situations. So it's twice your daily adult requirement for adult situations. However, this is based on a novel that I'm working on. So these are high-end literary adult situations. This is not the cheap, sleazy stuff. This is the good stuff. And now let me just do a quick scene from the show, and this bit's called One Day in Thailand. Bangkok. The name alone sounds a little skeevy, and from the moment I get off the plane, I'm on high alert. I'd read about the deep-fried tarantulas, tuk-tuk scammers, and locals that play volleyball with their feet. The decor in the airport doesn't help either. Smirking Buddhas, sneering Buddhas, a gang of Buddhas pummeling a three-headed snake. The airport bus drops me downtown on Sukhumvit Road. That's a boulevard that's supposed to be 2 blocks from my hotel. On the corner stands a local woman. She's wearing a t-shirt that says University of Nebraska. That's Nebraska with just 1 P. The whole area is peppered with these little carts selling noodles and soup. I start to walk and the sooty, humid air stings like a lung full of red ants. Immediately I'm lost. So I approach a guy. He's got a mossy, blonde beard growing down his sternum. He's wearing a fishing vest and shorts, and the chin strap on his wide-brimmed hat is pulled snug against his jowls. He looks like he's bracing for a typhoon. Excuse me, I ask, do you know how to get to a street called Soy 38? You from the U.S.? Yeah, I'm from Boston. Yeah, I'm from Texas. I was an MP back in Saigon, one of the last guys out. Last guys out. Wow. Do you know, is it okay to eat at any of these food carts around here? Oh, you don't want to eat around here. Soy cowboys, just a few subway stops. Subway stops. This whole Sukhumvit area is built on a swamp. I'm going to retire here. Retire here. Then he exhales into his hand and sniffs his breath. In less than 2 minutes, this guy has confirmed my worst fears about Southeast Asia. This place can do things to you. Permanent, mind-warping things. I put on my hat. Tighten my chin strap and walk away. Walk away. So that's my show, called The Chronic Singles Handbook. And the show actually did pretty well. I got some good reviews. If you insist, I'll read them to you. 4 stars. Ross's honesty makes the self-deprecating voyage of sometime lurid self-discovery a lot of fun to watch. The Winnipeg Fringe Festival, that's Winnipeg, Canada. A delightful show that kept the crowd laughing at all the right times. A fringe show that is worth seeing for the chronically single or very married alike. That's the Orlando Fringe Festival in Florida. Sharply funny, some of life's tougher punchlines. A quality solo show. Edinburgh Fringe Festival. So at this point, I'm feeling pretty good about myself. Working on my book, I'm getting some good reviews. Finally, 2015, I finished the novel. And so the novel was 80,000 words. That's a standard length for commercial fiction, a standard novel that you find in a bookstore. That's about 325 Microsoft Word pages. And the way the process works, so if you want to get a big publisher, big advance, the big money, you need to get a literary agent. And the way it works with a literary agent is you need to write something called a query letter, and then you send it out to these agents. And let me just read you a little bit of my query letter. So the way a query letter works is the first paragraph, you kind of explain what the book is about and where it fits in the marketplace, why anyone's going to buy it, and who the competing authors, similar authors are. So the working title for the book was The Loneliest Planet. So it was a takeoff on The Lonely Planet. Dear Agent, my comedic novel, The Loneliest Planet, offers an unflinching look at how men feel about sex, love, marriage, and massage parlors. So that's kind of a general overview. The audience includes men seeking insight into their own psyches, women seeking insight into men, and anyone interested in a gritty, bittersweet romantic comedy. So that's kind of the genre. It's a romantic comedy. It should appeal to readers of Jonathan Tropper, Joshua Ferris, and Sam Lipsyte. And these authors are a little more obscure. Jonathan Tropper, there was a movie that came out last year, This Is Where I Leave You. Anybody seen that? Okay, you've seen that? Yeah, so that's based on one of his books. So the first paragraph, how positioning of this book. The second 2 or 3 paragraphs are pretty much what the book is about, and I'll just give you a quick overview of that. So in the book, I used, the narrator has my name. His first name is Randall, or Randy, and the reason I picked that name is if, on my trip when I was in South Africa and Australia, the word Randy has another meaning, so that's why I stuck with the name. The narrator's name is Randall Burns. The novel follows the picaresque adventures of Randall Burns, 48, chronically single, and recently downsized out of a long-time job. He blows his severance on a trip around the world, hoping to change his luck with love. On the trip, Burns strikes out with women on 3 continents and suffers loneliness that would have broken Papillon. On the 4th continent, Burns accepts that he's going to die alone, and the sooner the better. Yes, I used that line as many times as I could. He bungee jumps, eats food from street carts, and visits a body spa named The Curious Finger. So that was my query letter that took me 3 years to write. So I had the query letter, and I'm ready to start sending it out to agents. So I sent it out to 30 agents, and none of them wanted it. I sent it out to another 30 agents, and none of them wanted it. Then I sent it out to 40 agents, and none of them wanted it. So in total, I sent it out to 110 agents. 7 of them liked the query letter and then asked for the manuscript and then didn't want it. I was going to send it to 120 agents, and the way I got that number is I was at one of these overpriced writing conferences, and I'm talking to an agent, and the agent's telling me about one of his clients, an author he took on, and that author sent his book out to 120 agents. And this particular agent I was talking to was number 120, and the name of that book was The Silver Linings Playbook. So I was going to do 120, I got to 110, and I was like, I can't deal with this anymore. So the process for getting a book published is first you try and get a big publisher, and first you try and get an agent because you want to get a big publisher. If you can't get a big publisher, you're going to go to smaller publishers, and you're going to represent yourself. You're going to be your own agent. So the next step is I send it out to 5 small publishers, and these guys, the Permanent Press out of Long Island, they were interested, and they sent me a contract. And I had been doing all this research on the internet about small publishers, and I was finding a lot of stuff that was not very flattering. So this is a website called Predators and Editors, and here's a whole article on fraud artists and scammers, and here's another website called Writer Beware, and there's more about scammers and artists, fleece artists and rip-offs, and scammers and fleece artists and rip-offs, and scammers and fleece artists and rip-offs, and parasites, parasites, parasites. So I hired a lawyer. And the lawyer went through the contract and gave me some suggestions, and so I put together a little spreadsheet of, if this, then that. I had this whole thing worked out. I was going to be prepared for the big negotiation with the publisher. But I had one more person to check with before I contacted the publisher for my big contract negotiation. I called my father. So my father's 80. He's been in small business, had small business his whole life. And I call him up and I say, Dad, do you have any advice for me with my big negotiation? My father says, how many other offers do you have? I was like, well, actually, Dad, I don't have any. Shut up and sign the contract. So I signed the contract. The next step in the process is the publisher sends you some ideas for covers. They're supposed to send you a couple of these. The publisher sent me one. And if you can see in the picture, there's in the middle, there's a beer bottle. So now this book I've been working on for 8 years. And this was literary fiction, in my mind. It's small press, they publish literary fiction. Literary fiction, there's no beer bottles in literary fiction. Literary fiction, there should be like a champagne flute or a wine glass or a martini glass. What's with the beer bottle? But the publisher also sent me a photo. This was my author photo that they doctored up. And I showed this to both of these to a couple of friends, and a couple of my friends were like, yeah, I don't like the beer bottle thing, but I like the photo of you. Why don't you tell the publisher that you want to make that your cover? So I, preparing for the big cover negotiation, and I call my father, and he's not home. My mother picks up the phone, and I send her both of these. I send her the cover, you know, that cover and this cover, and I'm like, Ma, I'm preparing for the big cover negotiation. What do you think? My mother goes, so, Mr. Big Shot Author, how long have you been in book publishing? 3 weeks. How long have they been in book publishing? 35 years. Shut up! The cover's fine. So I went with the cover. The next issue. With the contract that I signed, the publisher includes this letter. And it's basically, I'll read it to you, but it's, the gist of the letter is, no reviews, no book. And so the letter reads, Dear author, before you sign your contract, we wanted you to know what the book world is like. Generally speaking, books by non-celebrities sell between 700 and 1,500 copies. To even ensure that many copies, it is imperative that the pre-publication reviews be good ones. So now I was a little worried. Bad reviews, no book. No reviews, no book. So the way the process works is 4 months before your book comes out, the publisher sends the book around to a bunch of reviewers. So my book was supposed to come out in March. October, November, they sent out a bunch of books to reviewers, and as of December 21st, 2016, no reviews. December 28th, no reviews. January 10th, I get a phone call from the publisher. He's not very happy. Basically, I've gotten no reviews, so there's going to be no book. He's happy to do an ebook, but there's going to be no real book. And I beg, I plead, I offer to buy the whole run of books. He repeats, I'm sorry, no reviews, no book. So I'm in my therapist's office. I'm on the carpet. I'm crying. I'm begging. I'm pleading. I'm ready to take my life. And 2 weeks later, I get a call from the publisher. He's in a very good mood. My book has been reviewed by Kirkus. A month later, my book is reviewed by Booklist. Now, Booklist is it's a publication that librarians typically read. So I got 2 reviews. I had a book.